So an example of a rebuilt city is Waben, Germany, and this is featured in the opening case study in your textbook. What's important about Waben, Germany is city planners really took some creative measures in terms of recycling practices and housing design to reimagine this city as a new opportunity. So they rebuilt and redesigned this aging city in Germany, which can serve as a model for us here in the United States, particularly in those aging cities in the industrial rust belt that we have in Indiana and those neighboring areas. So this city is actually located in Freiburg, Germany. And now I'm going to show you a video that really highlights some of the things that we could learn from this city.
With its 225,000 inhabitants, the city of Freiburg is seen as the leading example of environmentally friendly urban development in Germany. Here, quality of life is the watchword. In the area of transport especially, many innovative ideas are implemented, such as the many home zones. A particularly special example of city development, one that is known well outside the borders of Germany, can be found in the Vauban area of the city. On the 38-hectare site of what was once a French army barracks, now stands an attractive family-friendly development for 5,300 people, and in which great emphasis is placed on living in an environmentally friendly way. Alongside buildings that have a reduced ecological impact and high levels of energy efficiency, transport also plays a key role. The whole residential area is traffic calmed, whilst the larger part of the development is car-free. Since 2006, the area has also been served by the tram. As a result, many people have decided to live without a car and instead use public transport and cycling to get around. In order to traffic calm the development, 30 km/h zones and home zones seek, as far as possible, to free the streets from parked cars. Although it is permitted to take a car right up to the front door of each building, in order to allow loading and unloading, for example, parking places are nonetheless not offered right by each building, but rather on the edge of the area in two common garages. In this way, the walking distance to the car is increased, and so people think twice about whether or not their car is really necessary for their trip, or whether in fact they would be quicker traveling by tram or bike. A further important way of calming car traffic is to largely eliminate through traffic by car. This plays an important role in improving road safety, and children can play on the streets free of traffic danger. The concept of car-free development has a firm footing here in Freiburg. The development of the site took many years, from the purchase of the land by the city in 1992, through an architectural competition to the beginning of construction in 1999 and the completion of works in 2010.
If you compare this concept to other concepts of car-free areas in Europe, you will see that this is a quite liberal one. Liberal in this way that you can own a car or not. And if you make it an extreme radical concept, nobody is allowed to own a car. You get real problems in marketing or in getting a successful concept.
Today, Vauban has about 5,300 inhabitants, with an average age of 28.7 years, whilst in the state of Baden-Württemberg there are about 634 cars per 1,000 population. Amongst the people of Vauban, there are only about 164 per 1,000. A further supporting aspect is that here and there in the development, restaurants and shops can be found, so that the area is not simply a residential dormitory. Rather, it offers a multifunctional mix of uses, all within a short walk of each other.
That sounds awesome. I love that. Okay, so how can we make our cities more livable? The question is, are there alternatives to this unplanned sprawl and wasteful resource use that we have here in the United States? There is an option that is falling on the radar of urban planners, and that is the idea of smart growth. Smart growth aims to provide a mix of land uses to create a variety of affordable housing choices and opportunities. And so the idea is to encourage infill development that avoids costly duplication of services and inefficient land use. This smart growth idea also aims to provide a mix of land uses that will allow more affordable housing opportunities and encourage stakeholders to participate in creating a vision for the city that encourages collaboration between the city itself and the people living there rather than confrontation. So here we have the different goals of this smart growth. Number one, create a positive self-image for the community, make the downtown area really livable, but also vital to the place as a whole, alleviate substandard housing. So make sure to place resources where resources are needed the most. Number four, solve problems with air, water, toxic waste, and noise pollution, which is something that we really don't talk about enough. Noise pollution is a huge problem, especially in urban areas. It not only disrupts wildlife and ecological functioning of the animals that live in that urban center, but also humans as well. Number five, improve communication between groups. And number six, improve community member access to the arts. And so focusing on this idea of smart cities and the future of urbanization across the globe, I want you to watch this YouTube video that I posted a link for on the tartan. Architects and urban planners are attempting to redesign metropolitan areas with a goal of making them more appealing, more energy efficient, and more livable while also preserving cultural and architectural history. And so this is a great example that we can take from Bob in Germany because they followed the principles of green design and smart growth while also preserving the history and the traditions of the community. And so some design principles of this movement include limiting the city size to only 30,000 to 50,000 people. Number two, maintaining green belts in and around cities that allow people to walk or bike to wherever they are going. Number three, determine in advance where development will take place and not just have this leapfrogging development of those big box stores or those strip malls. Locate everyday shopping and services so people can meet daily needs with less automobile dependency and less use of their time and their energy. And finally, encourage walking or the use of small vehicles like little Vespas, as they do in Italy all of the time, or those bicycles. There are countless European cities that we can look to as models for this, including Stockholm and Helsinki. They have a long history of innovative urban planning. One of these places is in Glasgow, Scotland. So here's a picture of Buchanan Street. And the idea here is to have walking streets. Basically, provide everything in one centralized location so people don't have to get in their cars and drive to multiple locations to do what they want to do in that day. So in this screenshot here, we have places to go shopping for clothes. We also have places to grab lunch or dinner or just socialize with friends or gather in one socialized location. And so these walking streets are becoming more and more popular in the United States, but they all already enjoy wide popularity in European cities. So what are some of the design principles that we can establish with this new urbanism? We understand now the foundational goals of the new urbanism, but what are some of those design elements that will help us achieve that new standard of urban living? Number one, we should promote more diverse, flexible housing, making it accessible to different socioeconomic groups. Number two, make cities more self-sustainable by growing food locally and shopping for that food locally. Also, recycling our waste and our water and using renewable energy sources. Number three, building green roofs on our buildings that include rooftop gardens, for example, that are going to simultaneously provide us with food, but also help us keep our air clean, conserve energy, reduce stormwater runoff, and also reduce those heat island effects that we discussed several lectures ago. And then finally, planned cluster housing or open space zoning, both of which are going to preserve at least half of a planned subdivision as a natural area that will help preserve urban habitat. And so to look at more in detail what urban farming looks like, I've posted a YouTube video for you to watch. So these better urban planning details, of course, include community gardens. We have community gardens in Knoxville. I'm sure there are some in Maryville as well. And here we have that open zone planning where there's lots of unused open space that could be used as a natural area or to grow food. The question is sustainable development possible? And so you've probably read throughout the book, many people argue that our present world population and economic levels are exhausting the world's resources. There's no way, according to these people, that more people can live at a higher standard of living without irreversibly degrading our environment. Others, on the other hand, claim that there's enough for everyone if we just share equitably and live modestly, which is particularly important for some of us here in the United States to do. So how can we continue improvements in human welfare within the limits of Earth's natural resources? Development, we've used this term several times, but that simply means improving people's lives. The idea is that we want sustainable development. So sustainability means living on the Earth's renewable resources without damaging the ecological processes that support all of us. And sustainable development then is the meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So our definitions of resources shape how we use them. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the economics that drive our urban planning decisions. So according to classical economics, as populations grow, scarcity of resources reduce quality of life, which then increases competition and ultimately causes populations to fail. That is definitely a Malthusian idea. And so classical economics assumes that natural resources are absolutely finite, that resources like iron, gold, water, and land exist in fixed amounts. There are different alternatives to this classical economic idea. We have neoclassical economics, which was developed in the 19th century. And by definition, in neoclassical economics, this expanded the idea that resources include labor, knowledge, and capital. So labor and knowledge and capital are resources because they are necessary to create goods and services. And they aren't finite because every new person can add more labor or energy to the economy. Now, finally, a probably foreign term to you is ecological economics. And this applies ecological ideas of system functions and recycling to the definition of resources. So in ecological economics, we also have the treatment of the natural environment as part of our economy. And that is considered natural capital. And it is a key consideration in economic calculations. It's important to consider natural capital because we have in our environment different ecological functions that are being served by our environment. This includes absorbing and purifying wastewater, processing air pollution, providing clean water, carrying out photosynthesis, creating soil, All of those are known as ecological services. And in ecological economics, we take those ecological services into account. So in neoclassical economics terminology, an important measure of growth and wealth is consumption. Okay, it's an important measure of growth and wealth because if society consumes more, it's presumably becoming wealthier. Okay, so the idea of throughput is the amount of resources a society uses and discards after consuming. So more throughput means that there's greater consumption and greater wealth. Okay, so they're tightly coupled. In other words, if you have higher throughput as a nation, you are considered more wealthy. So throughput is commonly measured in terms of the gross national product, or GNP. And this is defined as a sum of all products and services bought and sold inside of an economy. This GNP measure includes activities of offshore companies as well as onshore companies. You may be more familiar with a term called the GDP, which is the gross domestic product. And some economists think that the GDP is a more accurate reflection of the throughput of a nation because it reflects the local economy, because it accounts only for those goods and services that are bought and sold locally. Either way, in neoclassical economics, consumption is measured directly by throughput. In natural resource economics, this extends the neoclassical viewpoint to treat natural resources as important waste absorbers, as well as a source of new raw materials. The problem with natural resource economics is that natural capital, natural resources for those raw materials, for example, is considered more abundant and therefore cheaper than built or human-made capital. So not as much value is placed on natural capital than on built capital or human-made capital. Ecological economics incorporates really important principles of ecology. It applies ecological ideas of system functions and recycling to the definition of resources. This school of thought also recognizes efficiency in nature, and it acknowledges the importance of ecosystem functions for the continuation of our human ecologies and our human cultures. So in nature, one species waste is another species food. So nothing is really wasted. Everything is just recycled. And so in this idea of ecological economics, we need an economy that recycles materials and uses energy efficiently, much like a biological community already does. In ecological economics, we also have the treatment of the natural environment as part of our economy. So in this way, natural capital becomes a key consideration when we're making those economic calculations. Again, those ecological services and functions like purifying our air and our water, those are all built into our ecological economic calculations. These services, of course, we're not paying for them with dollars, right? So in some classical economics, of course, these would be considered free and they're not part of a calculation. But through the lens of ecological economics, we are putting them under the microscope because we don't pay for them with dollars, but we do pay for their absence indirectly. We suffer for them basically when they're gone. We don't have those natural absorbers of toxins or air pollutants, for example. So all in all, ecological economics is a much more holistic way to go about including the natural environment as part of our economy. We've talked about renewable and non-renewable resources, but here let's just provide definitions because both ecological economics and neoclassical economics distinguish between these two different types. So within non-renewable resources, these are things like fossil fuels. They exist in finite amounts and you can't make more of them. In contrast, we have renewable resources. These renewable resources are naturally replenished and they are recycled at a fairly steady, quick rate. And as an example, freshwater or living organisms. So how do we manage these non-renewable resources, the things that unfortunately we are most dependent upon for our energy sources today? Non-renewable resources like iron, gold, and other metals and minerals, they can be extended through more efficient use. Just paying attention to how we're recovering them and in what ways we are using them and consuming and discarding them. We can also, through technological developments, for example, substitute the use of something that is non-renewable for something that is renewable. We can also implement massive scale recycling that will extend our supply of non-renewable resources. We can recover sources of non-renewable resources by expanding technological improvements. This is something that feeds right into substitution. And then finally, on the other hand, if we fail to do a good job of managing the non-renewable resources that we have, they might just be completely exhausted in the future. And therefore, we will absolutely have no other choice but to come up with substitutions and new alternatives. There is a book that was focused directly on that problem of understanding resource limitations in a growing population. This book is authored by Donella Meadows and co-authors. It's called The Limits to Growth, and it came out in the early 1970s. It's basically a study of resource limitations that examines how the world economy in the future is going to deplete its resources depending upon a growing population, growing amounts of pollution, and growing amounts of industrial output. Most of the models that they incorporate in this book predicted that our population will boom and bust as we run out of natural resources and drown in pollution. So more or less like what we discussed in terms of population dynamics several lectures ago, the Kantian versus the Malthusian school of thought. These authors certainly went with the Malthusian school of thought in terms of resource limitation. And here's just a graphical depiction of their business as usual model from this book that they published. And what this is showing here is that there's a prediction that as population in green and consumption in purple grow, resources will continuously decline, shown in red. It'll continue to decline until there's just a huge population crash. But what's interesting is that after that crash, pollution continues to increase. And so it's going to continue to climb well after the industrial output, food supplies, and human population all have plummeted. What we need to think about, shifting from the Malthusian lens of that point of crisis to a more Kantian lens of how can we be innovators to solve our problems. There's an underlying faulty assumption in this view that the idea that the natural resources which we depend on are irreplaceable. So many criticize this model because it underestimates our ability to inspire technological innovations that could mitigate the effects of scarcity itself. They point out that scarcity can stimulate research and development that ultimately results in new processes and materials that extend our resources significantly. So Thomas Malthus, if you remember back to our lectures on population dynamics, he warned 2 centuries ago that food production could not continue to keep up with population growth and that we would all starve, we would all become poor, we would all fall into a life of crime and war. All of those were inevitable unless we slowed our birth rates drastically. What Thomas Malthus did not foresee, and probably had no way to foresee this, is that we would harness new innovative techniques in agriculture that would enable us to produce more food per person for today's large world population. And so similarly, one of the greatest worries in recent years is that we are approaching, or maybe have already approached, our peak oil. We depend on this oil globally as our energy resource. So how will a society so dependent on oil manage if our supplies dry up completely? You'll remember, this is where the good news comes in. You'll remember that from chapter 12, there's more than enough renewable energy available to meet all of our current needs. The fact that we're using up the cheap, easily extracted fossil fuel supplies is now making solar, wind, other renewable energy technologies really competitive. So just like we solved our problem with food scarcity several hundred years ago, we can today begin to solve our oil dependence problem by shifting our resources and our funding investments into renewable sources of energy like wind and solar. Next, let's talk about communal property resources. This is a classic problem in economics, and it's one of the difficulties where there is a shared resource that nobody owns, and therefore nobody feels the responsibility to take care of it, okay? And this problem was given a name called the tragedy of the commons. This name was given by a biologist in 1968 called Garrett Hardin, and he wrote an article called The Tragedy of the Commons. And in that article, he described how commonly held resources are degraded and destroyed because of self-interest. So in our case here, clean air, fish in the ocean, clean water, wildlife, and open space, they're all natural amenities that we exploit, but no one clearly controls. And so the problem with not having a centralized ownership is that it eventually, that resource, whatever it is going to become exhausted, depleted, completely run down, and unusable. So in this example that Hardin wrote, he theorized that it behooves each villager in a farming village, for example, in New England, to put more cows on the pasture. Okay, makes sense. Each individual farmer is going to become wealthy with each additional cow that's put out to pasture. However, the cost of overgrazing that same shared pasture is shared by everybody. So the individual farmer then suffers only part of the cost, but gets to keep all of the profits from the extra cows that they put on the pasture. So the commons, the common pasture land, becomes overgrazed, it becomes unusable, and therefore it can't be used by any of the farmers because all of them had only their self-interest in mind. This is also referred to as the free rider problem. The best solution that Hardin argued in his article is to either give coercive power to the government or privatize resources so that there is a single owner controlling and regulating resource use.